Hey folks, Kevin here. Well, it's March 31st, 2020, and today I thought I'd share with you my thoughts on garden beds. I hope that everyone's considering you starting a community garden or starting a small garden in their yard if at all possible, or possibly expanding their gardening system just so that we can have more food security. I think that's wonderful. And if we've already got garden systems, just make those gardens a little bit more resilient if possible. And recently I've had folks come by here and not be aware of the terms that I've used for our garden beds, which are permanent raised garden beds. And I'll explain why we use permanent raised garden beds here in this location. So I thought what I'd do is go over a few terms as far as I define different types of garden beds. So the first term that I would use is, what's the difference between a temporary bed and a permanent bed? Temporary beds, a good example of temporary beds are those large monoculture cornfields, hay fields, wheat fields, soy fields, oat fields, where heavy equipment, big tractors pull big implements behind them to turn the ground over and break it up, and then ultimately seed the area. And there's no real paths, and they may and it's usually one full season that they'll use that section of land to produce a certain crop. So at the end of the season, around here there's corn silage, there's corn, there's soybean, those sorts of things are just very common around here. So it's lots of big pieces of equipment typically, and these are just temporary gardens or temporary farming in a sense. Whereas permanent gardening is there's predefined garden beds and predefined paths. So let me give you another example. So sometimes people will have a place in their backyard where they're going to put in their garden each year. They'll have a spot for the cucumbers, they'll have a spot for the pumpkins and squash, the radishes, whatever it is that they're growing, and they may come in and do it themselves, or have someone else come in and rototill the area or plow the area, depending on the size of the area that they use. And each area, there's no defined paths. And so that's another temporary garden plot, if you will. Whereas when we talk about permanent in-ground or permanent raised beds or permanent sunken beds, we're talking about the paths being quite permanent, and the beds, whatever type, whether they're raised beds or in-ground or sunken beds, they're predefined as well. And the benefit of having permanent paths around permanent beds is we do less soil compaction, and soil compaction destroys the architecture or the structure of the soil. Structure, it determines function. So the structure is created by the microorganisms and the macroorganisms that live within our soil. And they create this structure as a result of their relationship with one another and the relationship with the plants that are planted there. So the healthiest plants come from being in the soil with a really robust microorganism content of that soil. And the microorganisms are very dependent on the soil structure. The soil structure allows water to flow through the area without becoming stagnant. It allows air infiltration, and it allows the exchange of micronutrients between the fungi that are there, the bacteria that are there, and the other microorganisms as well. So soil structure is least affected in a permanent bed, and therefore when we have a permanent bed, we want to have permanent paths so that the compaction that happens in the path. So we want to avoid soil compaction in our beds themselves. So an example would be after a rain, if you step on a garden bed, there's about a 75% compaction of the soil, if it's beautiful, rich soil that you've been creating for quite some time, just by stepping on it after a rain destroys a lot of the structure that's there and affects all the inhabitants, the microorganisms, and thereby affects the crops that you grow in that bed. So that's the difference between temporary beds and permanent beds. Now, permanent beds can be created by using a whole variety of different materials. Now, many people are familiar with Curtis Stone. He's an urban gardener, and he's located in Canada. And he's posted a lot of videos, and because of him being in a more of a drier climate, in a high desert climate, he doesn't have excess amounts of rain. Therefore, his permanent beds are in-ground beds. So what do I mean by in-ground permanent beds? Well, he always determines where the paths are and walks solely on those paths. And the garden beds, no matter whether he's planting grass, not grass, arugula, salad greens, carrots, or turnips, whatever it is that he's putting into those beds, and his beds are typically 30 inches wide, and I believe his paths are 8 inches wide. The bed height is the same height as the path. The bed and the path are the same height. Just that he makes sure to only step on the paths and not step on the bed, so that the soil structure and the microorganisms are all maintained without any soil compaction as a result of stepping on the beds. So I hope that makes sense. With permanent raised beds, we also have paths that are determined to be permanent, and we only walk on those paths. And our beds here are, most of them are 30 inches to 36 inches wide, just enough so we can span them with our legs. In other words, do a cowboy stance, one leg in one path and one leg in the other path, and we can work directly over the raised bed itself. So why do we have permanent raised beds? And again, the permanence is because the path is always marked out in the same location. So we have permanent raised beds because we live in an area where we get lots of snow during the wintertime, lots of rain in the springtime, and lots of rain in the fall. If we just had in-ground beds, similar to what Curtis Stone does, our ground would probably maintain a lot more moisture in that bed, and it'd be more saturated, and the temperature wouldn't be as warm in the springtime. Therefore, we build up the soil with compost or other materials, but we build up the bed so it's higher, and as a result of that, water will run off and go into the paths. And as a result, our beds are drier for longer periods of time. Now, if you look at our beds, you'll see that there's a large tarp that we put over the beds during the winter months. It's a real challenge around here with the high winds that we have, but whenever we can, we get the tarps covering all of our raised beds. So the tarps are black, and that helps us to do a few things. We can prolong our season where we can grow crops by planting into raised beds early in the springtime that have been tarped over the winter months and the early spring months. Like the last several days, we've had nothing but rain, and all of the beds get completely saturated. Fortunately, our beds that are tarped are the beds aren't getting wet. The water rolls off of the tarp on the raised beds and goes into the valleys of where the paths are. Now, that water serves a couple of functions during the winter months. Since we have high winds, we try to keep as much water in those paths where the water is collected, because a tarp is not permeable. Weed mats are permeable, so water goes through the weed mats but doesn't go through the tarp as long as there's no holes in the tarp. So by having the tarp be intact, covering the crops, covering the raised beds and the paths, we're able to keep the raised beds nice and dry during the winter months, prevent weed seeds from blowing in during the fall, winter, and early spring. And when we uncover when we remove the tarps and we uncover the beds, they're dry and they're warm because they're raised above the path level, and the sun radiates on them through that dark tarp. So we get nice, warm, dry beds early in the spring to plant our seeds in or put our transplant in. That beats all of the people who have the temporary beds around here because their soil is still wet and it's all at the same level. So I hope that makes sense. So one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this is people don't have to put in large scale beds like we have here, and there's gardeners and farmers that have larger scale systems than what we have. But it's a way of understanding what type of bed system works best. Now, if you live in a desert environment, you may actually want to not have in-ground beds or raised beds. You may want to have sunken beds so that it benefits from every drop of rain that comes into your property, and you get more saturation. Because we get greater amounts of rain, even though during the summer months we may have some droughts, we can water with drip irrigation during those times. But during the most of the year, we have to worry about the rain coming in the fall, winter, and spring, or snow. So we protect our beds with the tarps during the winter months and early spring months. They get solar radiation, get warmed up before we uncover the beds. The beds are dry and high, and we can plant into those beds earlier on. So what about someone who's thinking about potentially starting a community garden? Well, there's all different ways of building raised beds if you're in this part of the country, in an area where there's a significant amount of rainfall. You can make your rain beds out of old masonry blocks, whether they're bricks or they're cement blocks, or you can use metal siding material to go around. You can use 2x4s or 2x6s. These are pieces of pine lumber. I don't recommend using pressure treated materials, but you can. I'm just always worrying about some of the chemical components leaching out into the soil or damaging some of the microorganisms that live in the soil there as well. So you can let your imagination run, but if you're looking at a community garden, it's much easier to have very organized, similar sized beds, and raised beds work out pretty well, because that way different community members will recognize, oh, this is my bed, this is in row A, bed number 3, or whatever it may be in your community garden. So raised beds allow you to have a permanent path, which keeps you from compacting those soils, and you can use whatever materials you want. Now, Jean-Martin Fortier, the market gardener, he wrote the book The Market Gardener, and one of the things he does is he uses his BCS tractor. It's an Italian-made 2-wheel tractor. I've made videos on that on this channel. And he uses a implement that looks similar to a rototiller that goes on the back of the BCS tractor, but it's tilted on an angle so he can throw the soil from the path up onto the bed. So his paths may not be absolutely permanent. They may shift a little bit, but for the most part, he's never stepping on the beds. There's no compaction on the beds. He's staying off the beds. He's making them very uniform, and he's able to accomplish all of the same things as if he used a different material, whether it was 2x4s or blocks or whatever it may be. In our strawberry beds, you'll see that we use 4x8x16 blocks. Now that's my handicap bed that I designed in case we ever become unable to ambulate or to move around as well. So those beds, right now we have them as strawberry beds, and then we have another rain gutter garden beds, which are raised up as well. These are easy access for people who have limited mobility. Raised beds make things easier for people who have physical disabilities. Now, our paths, like Curtis Stone, the urban gardener, his paths, as I mentioned, I believe are 8 inches wide. Our paths are between 16 and 18 inches wide. I sacrifice the amount of growing space by widening my paths because I have big feet. My feet are size 13, and when I wear big boots, sometimes I'm out there working, or I'm wearing big bulky clothes and I'm carrying some of the big bins that I carry and set in the path. I don't want them leaning up on some of the produce or the gardening vegetables that we're growing. I want to be able to sit in there comfortably, and with our beds being as high as they are, it makes things much more comfortable for us to get in there and work in the garden. And it's key to design your garden so it's appealing, it's attractive, it's easy user interface, and it's comfortable. You enjoy going to your garden, so that's very important as well. So one of the things I would say, the slope of your property is how you decide how you're going to orient your garden beds. Often I'll hear people say, well, the sun's on over here and on. Yes, if you're in the northern hemisphere, you'd like to have your gardens get full sun exposure, maybe be on the south side of the property. But you do have to make sure that you're getting lots of solar exposure. You're getting this as much sun as you can, and the areas that you don't get as much sun, you put your crops that don't need as much sunshine in those areas that get shaded part of the day. But aside from that, the orientation of the garden beds, in my opinion, should be oriented with the slope of the property. If you're in an area of the country like we are, where we get lots of snow, lots of rain, and all that, if you're getting significant amounts of rainfall coming down, you want that rainfall to roll off of the bed, go down into the paths, and then run down the paths, down the slope of the property. So I have, if the slope is in this direction going downhill towards you, then I want to have my beds heading this way, not going this way, because that will impede the water from flowing down the slope of the property. So we want to have the water be able to exit out of the property. This may be different if you're going ahead and putting in sunken beds because you're in a true desert environment. You may want to put a swale system to collect as much water, which can work its way through the various garden beds. But I'm not an expert in that area. We've been doing this type of gardening for years, and I highly recommend, if you're in an area like Oswego, New York, where we live, and you get lots of rain, you want that water to go down the paths, your permanent paths, because you're not going to do as much damage to your beds. You won't have as much erosion at all. In future videos, I'll talk about cover crops and rotating the crops as well. But in this video, I really just wanted to tackle the types of beds, whether they're temporary beds or permanent beds, and that has a lot to do with where you're walking all the time, and all of the different materials. Here, I've seen all sorts of materials used for creating their beds. I've seen people use buckets to make the edge of the bed. I've seen old demolition materials, whether the bricks or pieces of concrete, to make the edges of a raised bed as well. So whatever it takes, you want to be able to make sure that you're not stepping on your garden beds. You want to maintain that the soil structure and the microorganisms that you're investing in, and it's those microorganisms that really do the investments in your plants, so you get really good nutrient-rich products from your gardens. So if you have any comments or questions or ideas about materials used that are free, so hopefully, or attractive, that would work really well in maybe for some people with their homeowners association, materials that would be working well where it's very attractive and easy to maintain, that'd be awesome to leave comments down below. I'm all for gradually getting our culture to accept to think that lawns aren't the only thing that we need to have, that garden beds can be absolutely attractive. And I think that would work out great. If anybody has suggestions or comments, leave them below. That'd be awesome. If you found this video of value, please give us a thumbs up, share it with your friends. And certainly, folks, stay healthy, take good care of yourselves. Remember, social distancing, we got to do this. And let's honor our heroes as well. Take care, folks. Have a great day.